Monica and Andrew, a love story in her own words, a narrated love story. Monica, 44, tells the story of how she and Andrew, 45, found each other in Asheville, North Carolina, and everything that came after. Prologue. People always assume that if you're in your 40s and still single, there must be something wrong with you. I used to think that too. I want to tell you what actually happened, because it wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't a disaster movie either. It was just two tired, careful people who decided very slowly to stop being careful. My name is Monica Reyes. I'm 44 years old. I run a small ceramic studio on the edge of downtown Asheville, the kind of place with a bell over the door and clay dust that gets into everything, including your sense of humor. Before that, I was married for 11 years to a man named Paul, and before Paul, I was a girl who believed love was supposed to feel like falling. It took me a long time to understand that the love that actually lasts doesn't fall. It walks in, sits down, and stays, even when you ask it not to. This is the story of Andrew Whitfield. This is the story of us. I met Andrew on a Tuesday in October, which is a strange detail to remember with such clarity, except that Tuesdays had become by that point in my life the most unremarkable day of the week. I opened the shop, I fired a batch of mugs, I answered emails about a wedding registry order for 40 bowls that a bride in Charlotte wanted glazed the exact color of a morning fog. It was an ordinary day until it wasn't. It was in that Andrew came in holding a broken kiln shelf like it was a wounded animal. I called about this, he said. I think I'm in the wrong place. I called a pottery studio, and the woman on the phone said to bring it by, but she didn't say the studio would smell like a bakery. That's the bisque firing, I said. It always smells like that on Tuesdays. He looked at the shelf, then at me, then back at the shelf, as if he were trying to figure out which of us could actually fix his problem. He was tall, a little sunburned along the back of his neck, the way men get when they spend too much time outside without meaning to, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had done a lot of listening in its life, lines around the eyes from squinting, not from frowning. I teach high school woodshop, he explained. One of my students tried to fire a project in our little electric kiln and cracked the shelf clean through. I have 12 kids with half-finished bowls and a shelf that looks like a jigsaw puzzle designed by someone who hates jigsaw puzzles. I laughed before I meant to. That was the first thing Andrew ever did to me. He made me laugh before I had decided whether or not I wanted to. I can sell you a new shelf, I told him, but if you want, I could come by the school and take a look at your kiln. Sometimes it's not the shelf, it's the setter. I don't know why I offered that. I had never once, in 6 years of running that studio, offered to leave it and go look at someone else's equipment. But there was something about the way he was standing there, holding a broken piece of ceramic like it mattered to him, not because it was expensive, but because 12 teenagers were counting on him to fix it, that made me want to help. He came back 3 days later, not for the shelf, but with a box of banana bread, as a thank you in advance, he said, in case the kiln thing works out. It was terrible banana bread, too much cinnamon, not enough banana. I ate 2 slices anyway and told him it was wonderful, and he narrowed his eyes at me like he already suspected I was lying, and I liked him even more for catching me. That was Andrew. He never let me get away with easy kindness. He wanted the true thing, even when the truth was your banana bread needs work. We didn't call it dating for almost 2 months. We called it seeing what happened, which is the phrase people in their 40s use when they've already been burned enough times to distrust their own hope. Andrew had been divorced for 4 years. His ex-wife, Carla, had moved to Nashville with their son Miles, who was 15 and, according to Andrew, allergic to phone calls but fluent in text messages with exactly 1 word in them. He drove up to see Miles every other weekend, 4 hours each way, and never once complained about it, though I could tell some Fridays it cost him more than others. I had been divorced for 6 years. Paul and I nazed stopped and then we stopped trying, and somewhere in that stopping, we stopped being able to talk to each other about anything that mattered. By the time we split, it was almost a relief. The kind of quiet that comes after a long headache finally lifts. So neither of us walked into this looking for a rescue. We walked into it looking, mostly, for someone who wouldn't require us to explain why we're tired all the time. Andrew started coming by the studio on Thursday evenings. Ash Cop's class let out. He'd sit on the old stool by the wheel and watch just being there while I worked. One night, about a month in, he finally asked if he could try it. You'll ruin it, I warned him. I ruin things professionally, he said. I'm a shop teacher. Ruining things and then figuring out why is basically my whole curriculum. He was terrible at the wheel. Genuinely, spectacularly terrible. The clay wobbled off center within seconds and flung itself across my apron, and he laughed so hard he had to put his hands, still coated in slip, over his face, which of course made it worse. I laughed too, harder than I had in years, and when he finally looked up at me, clay drying on his eyebrow, something in his expression changed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a movie moment, it was just a man looking at a woman and deciding, quietly, that he wanted to keep doing this, keep showing up on Thursdays, keep being bad at pottery, keep being looked at like that. He kissed me that night by the Kiln, of all places, which is not romantic in any way except that it was ours. It smelled like fired clay and cheap coffee. His hands were still a little rough with dried slip. It was the least cinematic first kiss of a first kiss in the history of first kisses, and I still think about it more than almost anything else in my life. I want to be honest with you, because I think people my age deserve honesty. Moore did not glide into deserve fairy tales. Andrew and I did not glide into a relationship. We crashed into one, the way two people crash into each other when they're each carrying furniture they don't want to admit is too heavy. Our first real fight happened 4 months in, over something that seems small now and felt enormous then. His son, Miles, came to visit for a week that July, the first time he'd be around long enough to really meet me. Andrew was nervous in a way I hadn't seen from him before, reorganizing his apartment 3 times, buying groceries he thought a 15-year-old might like, and then panicking that they were the wrong groceries. I offered to make dinner the second night, something easy, and I thought I was being helpful. I wasn't. Answering questions in the fewest words possible, and afterward, when he'd gone to his room, Andrew and I sat on the porch and I said, without really thinking about it, he barely looked at me all night. Does he know about us? Did you actually tell him, or did he just find out I was going to be here? Andrew's jaw tightened. I told him. He's 15. He doesn't owe you eye contact. I didn't say he owed me anything. I asked a question. It sounded like an accusation. Well, maybe I'm allowed to be a little hurt that your son won't look at me, Andrew, since I spent 2 hours cooking a dinner he barely touched. That was the wrong thing to say, and I knew it the second it left my mouth. But I said it anyway, because I was 43 years old and I still hadn't learned how to sit inside a hurt feeling without turning it into a weapon. Andrew stood up so fast the porch chair scraped against the boards. You don't get to make this about the dinner, he said, his voice low but sharp in a way I hadn't heard from him before. This is my son in a strange city with his dad's new girlfriend, 3 years after his parents blew up his whole life. He doesn't have to perform gratitude for you. He doesn't have to perform anything. I never said, I know what you said. I heard you. I'm telling you what it sounded like from where I was sitting, which is a place you've never had to sit, because you don't have kids, Monica, and I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because there's a whole part of this that you can't see yet, and I need you to trust me on it instead of scoring it like a dinner party. That one landed. It landed hard because it was true, and because it wasn't fair, both at once, the way the truest things in a fight usually are. I didn't cry in front of him. I'm not a crier in the moment. I'm a cry hours later alone in my car, which is exactly what I did. I drove home, and I cried, and I was furious at him, at myself, at Paul for a divorce that had nothing to do with any of this. At 15 years of being someone's wife, and then nobody's anything, and then, how terrifying it was to want that so much that a bad dinner could undo me. Longest 3 days of that whole summer. We didn't talk for 3. On the 4th day, Andrew showed up at the studio, not with banana bread this time, but with nothing in his hands at all, which somehow felt more honest. I was too hard on you, he said, before I could say anything. You weren't wrong to feel hurt. I panicked. Miles is the one thing in my life I can't afford to get wrong twice. I already got it wrong once, with Carla in front of him. I watched him watch us fall apart. I can't do that to him again, and when you said what you said, I heard it as the beginning of something falling apart, and I went straight to the worst version of the future instead of staying in the room with you. I wasn't trying to fall apart, I said. I was trying to be seen. I made a stupid comment about a dinner because I didn't know how to say the real thing, which is that I'm scared I don't know how to be part of a family that already exists. I've never done that. I don't know the rules. There aren't rules, he said. There's just Tuesday and then Wednesday and you showing up for both of them, badly sometimes, and me showing up badly sometimes too, and neither of us leaving over it. We sat on the studio steps for a long time after that, not really touching, just close, working our way back to each other one honest sentence at a time. It wasn't the fight that mattered in the end. It was that fourth day. It was learning that we could break something between us and then, deliberately, with our hands a little shaking, put it back together and have it be stronger at the seam than it was before. The way a good repair on a bowl can be more interesting than the bowl was when it was whole. Miles and I got there too, eventually, not that summer, but the next one, over an afternoon spent trying, and mostly failing, to teach him to throw a pot on the wheel, both of us laughing at how bad he was at it, the same way his father had been. Some bridges you don't build with big conversations. You build them with clay under somebody's fingernails and nobody keeping scores. If I'm telling this honestly, I have to tell you about the second fight because it was worse, and it nearly ended things, and I think that's the part people leave out of their love stories, the part where it almost didn't work. We'd been together almost 2 years. Andrew asked me to move in with him, not dramatically. Just one evening while we were doing dishes, he said, "What if you just stayed, officially, brought your stuff over?" And I said yes, because by then I loved him in the settled, certain way that made the question feel less like a leap and more like a formality. The trouble started with boxes. I had spent 6 years living alone after Paul, and in that time, I had built a life that was entirely stubbornly mine, my studio, my routines, my silence when I wanted silence, my ability to leave dishes in the sink for exactly as long as I pleased without anyone commenting on it. Moving into Andrew's house meant folding my life into a shape that already had a shape, and it turned out, resented that more than I expected to. Andrew, for his part, had spent 4 years as a single dad on alternating weekends, and he had systems, everything had a place. Dinner was at 6. The remote lived in a specific system seemed, to him, like chaos knocking at the door. I understood later that this wasn't about control. It was about a man who had lost control of his family once, catastrophically, and had rebuilt his life small, controllable certainties, walks, salmon, certainties because the big ones had failed him. But I didn't understand that yet, not in the moment, not when I him standing in the kitchen with his arms firing. "You said you'd call if you were running late," he said. I lost track of time. The glaze test needed another hour. "It's 10 o'clock. I made dinner at 6. I've called you 4 times. I'm not a teenager, Andrew. I'm not a teenager, Andrew. I don't need to check in every time I run late at my own business. This isn't," pressed his palming in, "it's about." He stopped, pressed his palm against his forehead. "It's about me sitting here for 4 hours not knowing where you are, and every scenario in my head getting worse the longer it goes. That's not my fault. That's something in your head, not something I did to you." I regret saying that more than almost anything I've ever said to him, it was cruel in its precision. I knew by then that his fear wasn't irrational, that Carla had once disappeared for a full day during the worst stretch of their marriage without a word, that Andrew's mind went to dark places when the people he loved went quiet, and I used that knowledge like a blade instead of like the tender thing it was supposed to be. He didn't yell. That was almost worse. He just went very still and very quiet and said, "I think I need some air," and walked out the front door, and didn't come back for 2 hours. When he did come back, we sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, saying the hard things slowly, one at a time, like people navigating a dark room by feeling along the walls. "I think I'm scared of disappearing into someone else's house," I told him. "I built a whole life by myself because I had to, and now I don't know how to let it be smaller so it fits into yours, and some nights I punish you for that, without meaning to. I think I'm scared that if I don't control the small things, everything falls apart the way it did with Carla," he said. "And I know that's not fair to put on you. You're not her. But my body doesn't always know that at 10 o'clock at night, when you're not home, I should have called. I should have asked instead of accused." We agreed, that night, on something small but important, that we would build new systems together, not his systems with me squeezed into them, not my chaos with him white-knuckling through it, but something we made from scratch, the two of us, the way you'd throw a pot from a fresh lump of clay instead of trying to reshape something that had already been fired. We started with something absurdly simple, a shared calendar, a 5-minute check-in every evening, no matter how small the day had been, and it worked, not because it was clever, but because we both kept doing it, on the boring days and the hard ones alike. People think love stories are made of big moments, the kiss, the fight, the reconciliation. But I think now that most of a love story is made of small repetitions. Andrew leaving a cup of coffee on my studio counter every morning before school, even on days we'd argued the night before. Me learning to text Miles first, so he'd know I was thinking of him even when his father wasn't in the room. The two of us most Sunday mornings, driving out to the farmer's market on Haywood Road, just to walk slowly through the stalls, buying too many tomatoes, arguing gently about whether the honey stand was overpriced. We went to a counselor for a while, not because we were in crisis, but because Andrew said something that stuck with me: I don't want to wait until we're drowning to learn how to swim. We learned in those sessions that we both had a habit of turning fear into anger because anger felt safer than admitting we were afraid of losing something. Naming that didn't fix us overnight, but it gave us a word for it, and catch you have a word for a thing, you can catch it a little faster the next time it shows up. There were more small disagreements after that. Of course there were. We were two grown adults with 3 decades of separate habits behind us, but none of them ever again reached the place that second fight had reached. We had found the floor of how bad it could get, together, and discovered we could stand on it without either of us walking away. That, more than any romantic gesture, was what made me trust him completely. And there was romance too. Don't misunderstand me. Andrew was, underneath the practical shop teacher exterior, absurdly sentimental. He once drove 4 hours round trip to bring me a specific brand of tea he knew I liked because the local grocery store was out of it, and pretended, badly, that he'd just been in the area. He learned, slowly and with great concentration, how to center clay on the wheel, not because he had any real interest in pottery, but because he wanted to understand the thing I loved most in the world from the inside. He was never smooth about romance. He'd get flustered trying to say something tender and end up saying something a little clumsy instead. And somehow that clumsiness moved me more than any polished line ever could have. He asked me on a Tuesday, of course. He said later he'd planned it that way on purpose, because Tuesdays are ours. It wasn't fancy. We were in the studio late after closing, and he asked if he could try the wheel again. He hadn't touched it in months. I sat behind him, guiding his hands the way I had 100 times, and the clay rose up between his palms, wobbling but holding, and when it was tall enough, he stopped the wheel and reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a ring, still a little damp from his hands, and held it up between 2 clay-covered fingers. I'm bad at speeches, he said, so I'm going to say the true thing instead of the pretty thing. I don't want any more Tuesdays that aren't officially, permanently, on paper hours. I want to keep being bad at this wheel for the rest of my life if it means I get to sit behind you while I do it. Marry me, Monica. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, which made him laugh, and the laugh turned into something closer to tears, which made me cry too, both of us covered in clay, holding on to each other in a shop that smelled like fired earth and cheap coffee, exactly the way it had the night of our first kiss. Miles, 17 by then, was the first person we told. He just nodded, like he'd known it was coming for a year, and said, "Took you guys long enough," which from a teenage boy is roughly the equivalent of a Shakespearean sonnet. We got married the following October, almost exactly 3 years to the week from the day Andrew walked into my studio holding a broken kiln shelf. We didn't want anything large or elaborate. We were both past the age of wanting a spectacle, and both of us, frankly, had already done the big traditional wedding once before, the first time around, and it hadn't guaranteed anything. Instead, we held it in the studio itself, closed for the day, tables set up among the shelves of glazed bowls and half-finished mugs. Miles stood up as Andrew's best man, visibly uncomfortable in a tie, and gave a short, halting toast that ever seen him, and that's mostly Monica's fault. So, thanks, I guess, which got the biggest laugh of the whole night. I wore a simple dress, cream-colored, nothing like the enormous white gown I'd worn at 28 for a marriage that hadn't lasted. Andrew wore a suit he'd bought second-hand and altered himself, because why waste fortune on something I'll wear 4 times in my life? We wrote our own vows. Mine were about clay, about how the things worth keeping are the things you're willing to reshape when they crack, throwing away and starting over. His were about kilns, about how some things need heat and pressure to become permanent, and how he was grateful every single day that life had put us both through enough heat to make this last. We danced, badly, to a song neither of us can now remember the name of. We ate too much cake. Somewhere around 11, Andrew's mother, 79 years old and sharp as a tack, pulled me aside and said, "I watched him after his divorce. He didn't think this was going to happen for him again. Thank you for proving him wrong." And I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to cry where nobody could see me ruin my mascara. That was 5 years ago. I'm 44 now. Andrew's 45, and if you're wondering whether the fairy tale ending held up once the wedding was over and the ordinary unglamorous weight of real life settled back in, I can tell you, honestly, that it did, though not because everything became easy. Andrew still teaches shop, though he's talking about retiring in a few years to help me expand the studio. We've been sketching plans for a second kiln room and a small storefront out front, where I can sell finished pieces instead of just running the wholesale side. Miles is 22 now, out of college, working in Charlotte as a mechanical engineer. He calls Andrew every Sunday, and he calls me too, now on his own, not because his father makes him, but because somewhere along the way, I stopped being Dad's girlfriend and became, in his words, basically my other mom. Don't tell my actual mom I said that. We still fight sometimes. Last spring, we had a genuinely stupid argument about whether to repaint the kitchen a color Andrew called sage, and I called depressing hospital green, and it took us 2 days and one very awkward dinner to work through it, though we laughed about it eventually. The way you can only laugh about a fight, once you trust that fighting doesn't mean the whole thing is in danger. That's the biggest difference between now and those early years. We don't panic anymore when we disagree. We know by now, in our bodies as much as our minds, that a disagreement is not an ending. It's just weather. You put on a coat, you wait it out, and the sun comes back because it always has before. We still do our 5-minute evening check-in even now, even on nights when nothing much happened. Andrew still leaves a cup of coffee on my studio counter most mornings, though these days he adds a small note sometimes. Nothing fancy, just good luck with the kiln, or don't work too late. And I keep every single one of them in a wooden box on the shelf above my wheel, because some Tuesdays, when the kiln is running hot, and my hands are tired and my back aches, in the particular way a 44-year-old potter's back aches, I take that box down and read through a few of them. And I remember the man who once walked in holding a broken shelf like it was a wounded animal, and I think, I did not fall in love with him. I built it, slowly, on purpose, the way you build anything worth keeping, with my hands, imperfectly, and I would do every single one of those imperfect years again, without hesitation, exactly the way they happened. That's our story. Not a beach, not an adventure, not a single dramatic moment that changed everything overnight. Just a broken kiln shelf, some very bad banana bread, 2 hard fights that taught us how to stay instead of leave, and a Tuesday years later, when a man with clay-covered hands asked me to keep doing all of it, forever, and I said yes before he even finished asking. Monica Whitfield, Asheville, North Carolina.